You know, it's not often you see Washington come together on, well, anything. But for a brief moment, there was this rare, massive bipartisan push. The goal? To force the government to release every single file related to the Jeffrey Epstein saga. It was supposed to be the final word, a promise of total transparency. But what we got, well, it created way more controversy than it solved. So let's break down how a promise for absolute clarity ended up creating so much confusion.
And that really brings us to the central question, doesn't it? A law, passed with almost unanimous support, was supposed to bring everything into the light. So how on earth did we end up here, with so many people feeling like the real truth is now more hidden than it's ever been?
Okay, so before we dive into what was actually in the files, we have to talk about what everyone thought was in them. Because for years, the entire public conversation was completely dominated by this one powerful and, as it turns out, mythical idea.
So, what exactly are the Epstein files? Right. It's not some single, neat little document. We're talking about a gigantic digital archive. Several million pages of documents, hundreds of thousands of images, thousands of videos. All of it was collected as evidence in the criminal cases against Epstein and his inner circle.
And this is where the official story just crashes right into the public narrative. You see it right here in this 2025 memo from the Justice Department. They were crystal clear about it. They said, point blank, the infamous client list just didn't exist, and they didn't find any proof of some widespread blackmail operation either.
This slide really gets to the heart of the disconnect. The myth, the story people were telling was simple. One list, a single key that would unlock this massive conspiracy. But the reality? It was a messy, complicated archive where names were mentioned in a million different contexts, most of which, it turns out, were totally mundane.
So you have this huge gap between what the public was expecting and what officials were saying. And that gap created an incredible amount of political pressure. That pressure just kept building and building until it became a firestorm that Washington simply couldn't ignore. The momentum in 2025 was like a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger and faster. It kicked off with these high-profile claims online, and when the DOJ pushed back with official denials, it just made people more suspicious. By the fall, Congress was really feeling the heat, and even President Trump, who had been resistant, did a complete 180 and told his party to vote for a full release. And wow, when they decided to act, they acted fast. I mean, just look at these numbers. A 427-1 vote in the House, then the Senate passes it unanimously, all on the same day. The message coming out of Washington couldn't have been louder or clearer. We're going to make everything public.
So, the law was passed, a deadline was set. And what happened next? Well, this brings us to the moment the public had been waiting for, the great unveiling of the files.
On January 30th, 2026, the Department of Justice dropped a truly staggering amount of material. We're talking 3.5 million pages of documents, and on top of that, 180,000 images and 2,000 videos. It was just this massive data dump that journalists and the public started digging through immediately.
So what did this mountain of data actually show us? For one thing, it definitely confirmed Epstein's close ties to Britain's elite. You've got emails that appear to show Prince Andrew discussing dinner at Buckingham Palace. Another one shows his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, calling Epstein a legend in 2009 while he was under house arrest for sex crimes. Now, it's super important to say, these weren't criminal accusations in the files, but the optics, staggering.
The tech world wasn't left out either. There were emails from 2012 showing Elon Musk asking about the wildest party on Epstein's island. And then you had these unsent draft emails from Epstein's own account making all sorts of wild claims about Bill Gates. A spokesperson for Gates flatly denied them, calling them absurd and completely false. And that right there highlights a huge problem with this data dump, trying to separate actual facts from rumors and, in some cases, outright lies.
Donald Trump's name also popped up hundreds of times, which makes sense given their past association. The mentions were all over the place. Some were just simple references, others were part of this unverified list of allegations the FBI had put together from a public tip line, and maybe most chillingly, some of the mentions came from Epstein himself. In private emails, he actually boasted that he knew how dirty Trump was and claimed he was the one able to take him down. A pretty chilling claim, but totally unproven.
Okay, so let's be absolutely clear on this, because it's the most important takeaway. While a lot of famous names appeared in these files, the vast majority were just mentioned in passing, in a flight log, a contact book, or a random email, without any accusation of wrongdoing anywhere in the documents themselves. That distinction is the key to understanding this whole thing.
And that brings us to the final chapter of this saga, and what became a really frustrating finale. The big promise of total transparency slammed right into the hard reality of black ink and redacted pages.
You know, it's easy to get lost in the politics of it all, but victims' rights attorney Gloria Allred really captured the human cost of what went wrong. The whole point was to expose powerful perpetrators, but the clumsy release actually ended up hurting the very people it was supposed to protect, with some survivors having their names and even photos improperly released.
The core problem here was how the redactions were handled. The law allowed them to black out info to protect victims, but the actual execution was just a mess. You had hundreds of pages that were completely blacked out, hiding who knows what. At the same time, other redactions were done so badly they failed to protect victims' identities. So in the end, they somehow managed to both hide information and harm survivors. It was the worst of both worlds.
And the public's reaction? Not good. Not good at all. A CNN poll from right after the release found that pretty much half of all Americans were dissatisfied. Compare that to just 6% who were satisfied. The overwhelming feeling was that the government was still hiding something important. This created a fundamental standoff. On one side, you have the Justice Department insisting, hey, we followed the law, the release is complete, and the redactions are just to protect victims. But on the other side, you have critics, including some of the politicians who wrote the law, saying, hold on, millions of pages are still being hidden, and those redactions are covering up way more than just victims' names.
And so, the Department of Justice basically drew a line in the sand. Their official position was that this was it. The case was closed, they said they had met their legal duty under the Transparency Act, and there wasn't going to be anything more.
But that just wasn't the end of the story. Congressman Ro Khanna, who was one of the architects of the law, pointed out a pretty significant discrepancy. The DOJ itself admitted it had found over 6 million relevant pages, but they only released about 3.5 million. The huge question of what's in those other 2.5 million pages is still hanging out there, completely unanswered. Which brings us right back to where we started. A law that was meant to provide total transparency ended up delivering this trove of information that was both revealing and, at the same time, incredibly incomplete. Sure, it answered some questions about Epstein's network, but it raised a whole host of new ones about what, if anything, is still being kept from the public.